Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Question of the Day with me, Femi, and
Fumi.
All right, so tonight we're going to continue our series on Moses, the character. And last time, if you recall, we had more of a introduction. We went into actually the first couple of chapters in the book of Exodus, as far as Moses. We talked about the landscape of how things were back then. What was going on,
what his name means.
What his name meant, yeah, stuff like that. Very interesting things that we went over in our discussion, and I believe we kind of ended. We capped it off by talking about Moses, being introduced as far as on the river in the basket, and so today we're going to go into the second part of the series and. Basically, I'm trying to summarize it into a question of the day because I'd already given you guys a hint as far as the 40 years of Moses' life. So I guess, the question of the day is almost like, what were the next 40 years of Moses life like? That's the word, life like. That's the question of the day. Because, a lot of the mediums that we've learned about Moses, whether through movies or cartoons or whatever, Moses is kind of, I don't know if it is clearly defined as far as what age Moses is, or because I think in the cartoon he was like a kid, I think that was one of the Prince of Egypt or something.
Yeah,
because as far as looks so really young, and in actuality, when Moses goes back to Pharaoh and does all the stuff that we remember him doing, we talked about this, he was 80 years old. But before we even get into that, those 80 years, let's talk about the first 40 years. So, the first 40 years of Moses' life. We're going to go into details about that. And Fumi is just going to give us a brief, very brief, we're going to go into details about all of this in our discussion tonight. But I wanted Fumi to just kind of give, kind of walk us into these next 40 years and how the Bible basically describes what's going on.
Okay, so I'm going to read out of Exodus 2:11 to 15. So it says, "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the men in the wrong, 'Why do you strike your companion?' He answered, 'Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Surely the thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by the well."
Okay. So this is kind of this we were introduced back now to Moses. This is 40 years later, and this is his initial encounter with the Egyptian. I think some people call it a taskmaster, or I think taskmaster is the word I've used. He was basically harassing one of the Hebrew people, and it talks about how Moses acted upon that, and killing him, and then the next day trying to be a mediator to an argument, and then all of a sudden they use it against him, and they find out about it. And before I even go into that, what's interesting to know, to read in addition to that, which I'm going to do that right now, is when you read that part of Exodus, I also read Acts, the book of Acts, and this is chapter 7, because this is it's labeled in my Bible as Stephen's sermon. This is Stephen, the one of the deacons in the early churches, and he is recounting Israel's history, and one of the things that he was talking about was Moses, the story of Moses, and it started in verse 17. So and we're going to talk about this particular area where Fumi read in Exodus, and I will read it in verse 23. So it's Acts 7 and verse 23. And he said, when he was 40 years old, talking about Moses, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. When he saw one of them being mistreated, he came to his rescue and avenged the oppressed man by striking down the Egyptian. He assumed his people would understand that God would give them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. I'm going to stop right there. So that was one thing that, it wasn't really said in Exodus. Like, if you read Exodus, it almost seems like, one day Moses just got out of the palace and he just thought, hey, you know what, let me go see my people. Let me go see how they're doing. And then all of a sudden he sees that and reacts. But here Stephen is, he's letting us know that, Moses, like, that mindset, like it says in Exodus, what was the words that he even used? Like, I think it said, like, it came upon him, it came into his mind to go see his people. Let's see, he went out to his own people. Like, for him to make that decision to go to his own people, it was something that it was based on an instruction from God. Like, he knew, like, it's basically saying that he knew that God was going to use him to deliver the children of Israel. Like, God had revealed that to him within those first 40 years of his growth, coming into this moment. That was a revelation that was given to him by God as far as his role in helping the children of Israel.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because when I think of Moses and his actual realization that God is trying to use him, the first thing I think of is like the burning bush. I don't think of like this scene, because like prior to this and like him growing up, I always thought like he didn't know, and this was just like happenstance, that he just saw his two Hebrew brothers arguing and he wanted to stop it. But that is very interesting, because that's not something that I ever realized. Referencing Acts 2, that this is actually the first time I've ever compared both of them. But yeah, it does show that he already knew about it.
Yeah, so it's not common that a lot of people would think to read this, but there are clues, there are indications that when you read the book of Acts and along with that passage of Exodus, where sort of fill in the gaps a little bit, because Moses he knew that God was going to use him, but the thing was, like, the method, the way that God was going to use him was where he did not have a full grasp of at this point of his life. One of the other things that was even interesting to note is in verse 22, prior to that part where Stephen is talking about, he talks about how Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptian and was powerful in his speech and his actions. Like, one of the things I remember Miss Tracy, she talked about it last time, he grew up in the palace, so a lot of things, he was basically, since Pharaoh's daughter brought him into the palace, like, Pharaoh, they raised him up like with the education, with all the wisdom, and with all the training of some Egyptian, of royalty, of like a royal line. So he wasn't, he was very knowledgeable, they trained him. He had good speech and everything. And it's important to note that, as we're going to go on further and later on, but one of the things I just wanted to point out was that he was led by God. That's why, when you even think about the action of him choosing to kill and, choosing to be a mediator and all that stuff, like, it's not something that's just driven out of just a natural, urge to do that. And, let's not also lose the fact that, this is 40 years and he's in Egypt as well as his people were in Egypt. So he always knew that they were in bondage. He had seen that every day of his life in those 40 years. So I don't believe that this one day, all of a sudden, like, all that stuff looked different just out of a random. Like, he was led by God because he knew that God wanted him to be the deliverer of his people, but he did not know how. He thought this was his way. And that's kind of like, this is one of the scriptures that you can kind of use it, more in a practical way when you think about it, as far as like, when God reveals his plan to us and then we sort of take it upon ourselves to do it our way. I mean, come on, like, just prior to all this in Exodus, I mean, it talks about Abraham. You remember Abraham was supposed to have the promised son, and you remember he made
his own plan.
He was like, okay, God, you said y'all was going to do it, and then he tried to do it his own way, but God was like, no, that's not how it's going to be done. So yeah, in this part of Exodus, so I'm going to just continue reading from Stephen's account just to kind of cap off like what we're talking about tonight. And then it said, I think I stopped at 24, right? It said, when he saw one of them mistreated, he came to his rescue and avenged the oppressed man by striking down the Egyptian. He assumed his people would understand that God would give them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. The next day he showed up, and when they were fighting and tried to reconcile them peacefully, saying, men, why are you brothers? Why are you mistreating each other? But the one who was mistreating his neighbor pushed Moses aside, saying, who appointed you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me the same way you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And it says, when he heard this, Moses fled. He became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. Another bonus question for you guys that I'm going to talk about. Do you guys know who the 2 sons were that Moses had in Midian? So be prepared to answer that one. And then it says, actually, we're going to stop there.
My question is, why would he assume that?
Why would who assume what?
Why would Moses assume that the children of Israel would use him? Like, when you just read, what verse is that?
He assumed his people would understand.
Yeah, why would he assume that? Because it's like, from outside looking in, right? We're brothers, but you're getting special treatment, and I'm not getting special treatment. And this is like the first time you've ever tried to do anything. So why am I just automatically going to assume you're here to help me?
I mean, yeah, that's a good question. Because one of the things that we also have to keep in mind, because I mean, you figure out as we read further along, you know that the children of Israel, they were constantly praying and asking God for deliverance. You know, they were enslaved and they needed to get out of it, and they were asking God. They were continually pleading with God. And if Moses has received a directive from God that, hey, I'm going to use you as a deliverer for the people, then it's like, hey, shouldn't everybody kind of get this picture now? It's like, shouldn't this be a prayer answered? But I should say, like, most important thing, and what Moses, would soon come to learn, that we also should realize, is that the deliverer was God in all of this. Like, just to kind of give you guys a fast forward overhead, God was the deliverer. Moses was just an instrument of what God was going to do for Israel, and that's what he didn't understand. So it's like, if you kind of take God out of the equation, and you taking him out of the equation as far as him doing the work, and you think that, okay, God chose you, God said you're going to have something, but then how you get that thing, God is not involved in that, then automatically your assumption is that you have to do something in order to retrieve that, so that you can conclude that, okay, God let me have that. And that's where we all missed the mark, and that's one of the lessons that we learn out of this period of Moses' life. So I wanted to kind of like put that out there. So we're going to go into a discussion about all the other things, all the things that you guys might have seen in your reading that might have stood out to you. Did you guys know about chapter 7 as far as Acts? Did you guys read that as well? And I'd like to hear from all of you as far as your questions and anything you have to add tonight. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to this discussion because this is new to me. So
right.
I've never read Exodus from this perspective, so yeah, I'm interested to hear the feedback.
Yeah, it's gonna be good. So we'll see you guys later tonight.
Bye guys.